Somewhere in a forest 60,000 years ago, a man reaches for a mushroom, hesitates, and puts it back down. He's never heard the word toxin. He's never seen a liver fail. But something stops his hand anyway. That hesitation is the reason you're alive right now watching this. You are descended from the people who guessed correctly more often than they guessed wrong. Here's what most people never think about. Our early ancestors didn't figure out what was safe to eat through careful reasoning. They figured it out through dead relatives, ruined dinners, and a warning system that's still running inside you today, right now, whether you know it or not. This is the story of how the human body and the human tribe, together, built the world's first food safety system. No labs, no FDA, no expiration dates. Just instinct, memory, and a few million bad afternoons. Before culture, before language, before a single lesson was ever taught, the body already had a plan. Human taste buds come wired with an ancient alarm. Bitterness is one of the oldest warning labels in nature because an outsized share of poisonous plants taste bitter. Babies today, with zero life experience, still recoil from bitter flavors on reflex. Nobody teaches a baby to do that. It's pre-installed. Smell runs the same program. A rotting carcass gives off compounds the human nose is almost violently sensitive to, and there's a good evolutionary reason for that. Ancestors who found that smell pleasant didn't tend to survive long enough to pass on the trait. The ones who gagged and backed away did. Every time you wrinkle your nose at spoiled milk in your fridge, you're running software that's been in continuous use for longer than the species has had a written language. Now here's where it gets more interesting than a simple reflex. The human body doesn't just flinch at bad smells. It learns to hate a specific food after just one bad experience, and it does this faster than almost anything else the brain learns. Eat something unfamiliar, get violently sick a few hours later, and your brain will often bind that nausea to the taste of the food itself, even when the sickness had nothing to do with it. Ask anyone who got food poisoning from shrimp on a bad night out and still can't look at shrimp the same way years later. That's a documented phenomenon researchers call one-trial learning, and it's rare for any animal to lock in a permanent memory from a single event this efficiently. But when the cost of a second mistake is death, evolution doesn't wait around for a bigger sample size. It commits hard off of one data point, because a species that needed 3 bad meals to learn a lesson usually didn't survive to eat a third meal. So before a single tribe existed, before anyone told anyone anything, bitterness, smell, and one bad memory were already doing triage. That got early humans most of the way there. It didn't get them all the way there. For that, they needed each other. Instinct is a decent first filter. It is a terrible final answer. Plenty of dangerous foods taste completely fine, and plenty of safe ones taste unpleasant at first. So human groups built something instinct alone could never manage. A shared, living record of what had already killed someone and what hadn't. Picture it like an unwritten ledger, passed down every single generation. Someone eats a new berry, feels nothing, eats it again next season, fine, logged as safe. Someone else eats a different berry from a similar-looking bush, and by morning they're doubled over, or they never wake up. That entry didn't need a laboratory. It needed one bad afternoon and a group of people paying attention. Within a generation, that plant had a reputation, and children grew up already avoiding it, often without ever being told the specific reason why. Nearly every human culture on record arrived, independently, at the same basic testing method without meeting each other, without sharing a word of language. Try a little, wait, and watch. A tiny taste of an unfamiliar root. Not a bite, barely enough to register on the tongue. Then hours, sometimes a full day, of waiting to see what the body did with it. Small amount, wait, escalate if nothing happens. If something did happen, that plant got marked and passed down as a warning, sometimes encoded in stories that sounded like folklore but were really poison maps dressed up as legend. A grandmother telling a child that a certain root belongs to an angry spirit and must never be touched usually isn't superstition standing in for fact. In a lot of documented cases, it's the reverse. It's fact, wearing the costume of superstition, because a warning wrapped in fear travels further and survives longer in an oral culture than a flat instruction ever could. Some foraging societies that anthropologists have studied went a step further and distributed the risk itself. When a genuinely unfamiliar food source turned up, it wasn't always one person who tested it alone. The taste was shared out in small portions, so no single person absorbed a potentially fatal dose by themselves, and if something did go wrong, the group had several people's worth of symptoms to compare at once instead of just one. It sounds almost clinical to describe it that way, but functionally, it was a risk management strategy, running on instinct and social structure instead of statistics. And humans didn't just watch each other. They watched everything around them. Watching which berries birds gorged on safely was one clue researchers believe early foragers used, though an imperfect one, since birds can safely eat things that would drop a human where they stood. A berry that's harmless to a robin can still shut down a human liver. So the sharpest observers weren't copying animals blindly, they were cross-referencing, tracking which foods overlapped safely between species and which didn't, building a mental map through pattern recognition across dozens of plants, animals, and seasons, stored with no writing at all, purely in memory and conversation. Some went further still, watching sick animals specifically. Certain primates, when unwell, are known to seek out particular leaves and clays with no obvious nutritional value but real medicinal or detoxifying effects, a behavior scientists call zoopharmacognosy, animals essentially self-medicating. Researchers studying hunter-gatherer ethnobotany have suggested that human foragers living alongside these species for tens of thousands of years likely noticed this too. If a sick chimpanzee sought out a specific bitter leaf and seemed to recover, that was worth testing, cautiously, by people willing to trade a small risk for a shot at understanding what that plant did to a struggling body. Instinct built the alarm. The tribe built the archive. But there was still a whole category of food this archive couldn't unlock on its own. For that, humans needed something closer to a chemistry lab, even if nobody involved knew that's what it was. Fire changed the entire equation, and it's easy to underrate this today because cooking feels so ordinary. Cooking didn't just make food taste better. It broke down toxins in plants that were completely inedible raw, and it killed parasites in meat that no amount of watching, waiting, or smelling could have ever detected. Entire food groups opened up for the first time, not because anyone understood chemistry, but because someone, somewhere, cooked something out of desperation or curiosity and noticed it stopped hurting people. Take cassava, still a staple food for hundreds of millions of people worldwide today, and familiar to American kitchens through dishes like tapioca. Eaten raw, certain varieties release compounds that convert into cyanide in the body. Left unprocessed, it can kill. Yet across multiple regions that had no contact with each other, communities independently developed a multi-day process, peeling, soaking, grating, and fermenting the root before it ever touched a fire, that strips the toxin down to nothing. Nobody wrote a paper explaining why every step mattered. It simply became the way you make cassava, passed down as tradition, because the version of the tradition that skipped a step didn't leave descendants around to keep skipping it. Acorns tell a similar story, and this one hits closer to home, since acorns were a major food source for many Native American nations across what is now the United States, from California's oak woodlands to the eastern seaboard. Acorns are rich in tannins, which make them bitter and, in enough quantity, genuinely hard on the gut and kidneys. The fix wasn't obvious, but trial and observation found it. Crush the acorns, then leach them repeatedly in water, sometimes running water, sometimes buried in mud near a stream bed for days, until the bitterness and the harmful compounds washed out. Groups an ocean apart landed on versions of the same core idea without ever comparing notes, because the underlying chemistry was identical everywhere, and human trial and error kept converging on the same answer. Even the human body itself joined this arms race, not through behavior, but through biology. Populations with long histories of dairy farming developed the ability to digest milk into adulthood, a trait most humans on Earth still don't actually have, since most societies historically never depended on adult milk consumption, which is part of why lactose intolerance is the biological default for most of the world's population, not the exception. Populations with long histories of alcohol and fermented foods in the diet show measurable differences in how efficiently their bodies process alcohol compared to populations without that history. These aren't habits. They're changes written into DNA over thousands of years, because the humans whose bodies happened to handle a local food source a little better tended to outsurvive the ones whose bodies didn't. Diet didn't just get filtered through knowledge. It got filtered through the genome itself. And none of this, the taboos, the rituals, the animal cross-referencing, the slow accumulation of trial and error, ever lived in one person's head. It lived in the group, like a redundant backup system. An elder who remembered a bad harvest decades earlier. A mother who'd watched her own mother prepare a root a very specific way, down to the exact number of days it needed to soak. A hunter who knew precisely which organ of an animal carried something dangerous and which parts were perfectly fine to eat. Lose one of those people to an early death, lose one link in that chain, and real knowledge could vanish from a community within a single generation, taking decades of hard-won trial and error down with it. Communities that told stories, that repeated warnings even when the warnings sounded exaggerated to outsiders, tended to survive intact. The ones that let knowledge die with the person who held it didn't get a second chance to relearn the same lesson before it cost them again. And children absorbed almost none of this through direct instruction, which flips how we usually imagine ancient parenting. Anthropologists studying traditional foraging societies have repeatedly observed toddlers mimicking exactly what the adults around them ate, refused, spat out, and prepared, copying the hesitation and the disgust reaction long before they understood any reason behind it. A child watching a parent recoil from a plant learns the recoil first. The reasoning, if there ever was one spoken aloud, comes later, or sometimes never. Culture functioned as an external memory bank for survival information, letting every new person inherit thousands of years of hard-won trial and error without personally needing to survive a single one of those trials. None of this was flawless, and it's worth resisting the urge to romanticize it into some kind of perfect ancient wisdom. People still died from bad calls, a misjudged mushroom, poorly prepared meat, a plant that looked identical to a safe relative but carried a fatal difference invisible to the eye. Even today, U.S. poison control centers field thousands of calls a year about wild mushrooms alone, and most of those calls involve adults who should, in theory, know better. Famine years forced people into genuinely dangerous, poorly understood experiments out of desperation, and plenty of those experiments ended badly. Survival was never a guarantee. It was a probability that improved with every generation that paid attention, argued over near misses, and passed the argument along. The humans alive today aren't descended from the fearless ones. They're descended from the suspicious ones, the cautious ones, the people willing to trust a warning even without fully understanding the reasoning behind it. The ones who heard, "Not that one," and didn't need to see a body to believe it. So next time you toss out food that smells even slightly off, or feel an inexplicable wave of disgust at something spoiled, or catch yourself hesitating over a dish you've never tried, notice that reaction for what it actually is. It isn't squeamishness. It isn't irrational. It's a warning system tens of thousands of years old, still running in you exactly as it ran in them, built out of bitter tongues, sensitive noses, remembered deaths, careful rituals, and stories that scared children into staying alive. It's the same system that let one species eat its way across every continent on Earth without a single chemistry lesson. And it's still working, quietly, every single time you decide what's safe enough to put in your mouth.